I sat on the edge of our bed, the familiar creak of the mattress beneath me a stark reminder of the life I once cherished with Wesley. At 32, I had dreamed of a future woven with threads of love, partnership, and shared dreams, a tapestry of a life we'd build together. But now, as I traced the fraying edges of the quilt his mother had made us as a wedding gift, I felt a chasm between us, a gaping void that seemed impossible to bridge. The man I had married, the one whose laughter once filled our small apartment and whose warmth had been my anchor, had faded into a stranger I barely recognized. Where there had once been late-night conversations and stolen kisses, there was now only silence, heavy with resentment. It hadn't always been this way. I could still remember the early days, when Wesley's steady job at the factory brought a quiet pride to his eyes, and I'd come home from my shifts at the diner to find him tinkering with some new project in the garage. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Two kids from modest roots who'd found each other in a world that didn't always feel kind. But then the layoffs came, swift and merciless, and the stable ground beneath us crumbled. Overnight, the financial burden shifted onto my shoulders, and I started picking up extra shifts, the exhaustion seeping into my bones as I scrubbed tables and poured coffee for strangers. I watched as Wesley, one so full of life, began to shrink under the weight of his unemployment. His confidence, that quiet strength I'd always admired, eroded with each rejection letter. Each day spent staring at a computer screen that offered no hope. The vibrant man I'd fallen in love with was slipping away, replaced by a shadow consumed by self-doubt and frustration. I tried to be patient, to support him through it, but it hurt to see him like that. So lost, so unlike the Wesley I'd known. And as the months dragged on, a bitter seed of anger took root inside me. I couldn't help but resent him for not being the provider he'd once been, for not fighting harder to pull himself out of the mire. I'd come home after a double shift, my feet aching and my patience worn thin, only to find him on the couch, the TV droning in the background, a half-empty beer in his hand. I'd bite my tongue, but the unspoken words festered. Why can't you try harder? Why am I the only one carrying us? The strain wasn't just about money, though that alone was enough to fray our nerves. 2 years earlier, Wesley's father had passed away, a sudden heart attack that left a hole in his world. I'd held his hand through the funeral, watched as he stood stoic and silent by the graveside, but I hadn't realized how deeply that loss would linger. His father had been his rock, the man who'd taught him how to fix a carburetor and how to stand tall even when life knocked you down. Without him, Wesley seemed unmoored, his ambition and drive buried alongside the man he loved. I'd see him staring at old photos, his eyes distant, and I'd feel a pang of helplessness. I wanted to reach him, to pull him back to me, but he was drowning in a grief I couldn't touch. In my own loneliness, I started to drift. At work, there was Tom, a co-worker with kind eyes and a quick smile who always seemed to know when I needed a break. It began innocently enough. Shared complaints about rude customers, a laugh over a spilled tray of dishes. But soon, those conversations stretched longer, lingered past the end of our shifts. He'd listen as I vented about Wesley, about the bills piling up in the silence at home, and he'd nod in a way that made me feel seen. I knew it was dangerous, this pull towards someone who wasn't my husband, but it was intoxicating to have someone validate my frustrations when Wesley was too lost in his own darkness to notice mine. I'd catch myself smiling at a text from Tom, my heart racing with a mix of guilt and exhilaration, and I'd tell myself it was nothing, just a friend, just a lifeline in a storm. But the storm broke one night, and there was no going back. I left my phone on the kitchen counter, too tired to think about it after a grueling shift, and Wesley found the messages. I came home to him standing there, his face pale and his hands trembling as he held the screen up to me. "Who the hell is Tom?" he demanded, his voice low and raw. The confrontation that followed was a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. He accused me of cheating, of abandoning him when he needed me most, and I fired back, my own hurt spilling out in jagged shards. "You abandoned me first," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "I've been holding us together, while you sit there feeling sorry for yourself." His eyes flashed with betrayal, and it broke my heart to see it. But in that moment, I felt a twisted sense of justification. I wanted him to hurt like I did, to feel the weight of our crumbling marriage, the sting of all the things we'd left unsaid. The fight didn't end there. In the days that followed, I found myself spinning our story to friends, exaggerating the mess of our finances, and painting Wesley as the sole reason for our misery. He's given up, I'd say, my voice thick with conviction. I'm the only one keeping us afloat. It was easier to blame him, to cast him as a villain, than to admit how lost I felt too. I'd sit in the diner during slow hours, replaying our arguments in my head, convincing myself that I was the martyr in this tale, the one who deserved sympathy. Then came the night I'll never forgive myself for. We were arguing again about money, about Tom, about everything, and in a blind surge of rage, I lashed out. Maybe if your dad were still here, you wouldn't be such a failure. I spat, the words slicing through the air before I could stop them. The room went still, and I saw his face crumple, the pain so raw it stole my breath. His father had been his hero, and I had just turned that love into a weapon. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked out of the room, the silence louder than any scream. The next morning, he told me he was filing for divorce. I watched him pack a bag, his movements deliberate and quiet, and as the door closed behind him, I felt a strange cocktail of relief and despair. It was over. We'd reached the end. But the fallout didn't stop there. At work, my web of half-truths unraveled. I'd been fudging my hours to make ends meet, and when it came to light, the reprimands were swift. My manager's disappointment stung more than I expected, and I felt the ground shift beneath me again. Meanwhile, I heard through mutual friends that Wesley was starting to pull himself together. Free from the anchor of our toxic marriage, he'd found a new job, a spark of the old him flickering back to life. The irony twisted in my gut. While I was sinking under the weight of my choices, he was rising, phoenix-like, from the ashes we left behind. Loneliness settled in like an unwelcome guest. Friends I'd leaned on during our unraveling began to pull away, unsure how to handle the mess I'd become. Tom, too, faded from my life. Our connection had been a crutch, not a foundation, and it collapsed under the reality of my divorce. I'd sit in our empty apartment, the silence deafening, and replay every moment that had led me here. How had I let myself stray so far from the woman I'd once been, the one who'd vowed to love Wesley through better or worse? I'd been so quick to point fingers, to cling to my resentment, but now I saw the truth staring back at me in the mirror. I played a role in our downfall too. My anger, my betrayal, my cruel words, they'd all been bricks in the wall that divided us. The pain of losing Wesley hit harder than I'd expected. I thought letting go would free me, but instead it left me adrift, grappling with regret and questions that had no easy answers. As I sat alone in the quiet, the quilt draped over my lap like a relic of a life I'd lost. I knew healing wouldn't come quickly. Time might soften the edges, but real mending would demand more, a reckoning with my own heart, a hard look at the choices I'd made and the woman I wanted to become. For the first time in months, I let myself cry, not for him, not for us, but for me and the long road ahead.